So, good afternoon again, and welcome to this new session of the Ethical Humanitarianism's series. My name is Divine Fu, and we are broadcasting through Humada Institutes for Humanities in Africa. And this is a collaboration with our colleagues at the Fredensel University, specifically FIFE, which is the Fredensel Institute for Evaluation. And we really are privileged today to be starting this particular session of the Ethical Humanitarianism series with an artist that really does a particular kind of musical performance, which creates encounters between Southern Africa with its history and also what it calls Western classical music with West African griots, but also with a lot of influences from the Malian Kora music. Derek Gripper is a musician with whom many people are keen to listen to. When we did advertise the name and mention that Derek Gripper was going to be here, we did see that so many people were excited, to listen to that performance. Also because as a Humanities Institute, we do believe in art. We invested in art, we invested in the humanities, we are invested in performance, we are invested in alternative forms of curating knowledge and also activating or provoking intellectual conversations. And music is one of those, and performance is another. I also would like to emphasize that as part of this, what we call the Kora project, which is a kind of a Pan-African conversation around arts and performance, supporting arts and performance projects is a really key part of our objectives. So a project such as Baxter and the push towards supporting and driving the work at Baxter is something that we are really keen on investing in, and also this initiative. So Derek is going to be with us, have this presentation for the next 25 to 30 minutes. And in the course of that, we will continue to engage him and provoke him in conversation. And at the top of the hour, we will enter another kind of conversation which will engage this very deep intellectual music from Derek, who has played with many players, like Tumani, Diabate, and many others. So thank you, Derek.
Thank you,
and thank you for being here. And we are looking forward to listening to you and enjoying this time.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a piece called Tutujara, which has had a long history. Hard to know exactly what the history is, but it started in recorded history on an instrument called the Ngoni, which is a kind of a cousin of the guitar. It's a fretless lute. It's made of a hollowed out piece of wood, so it's kind of like a drum body really, with a skin, and then it has a long hardwood neck which is fretless, and it's one of the fretless lutes of the West African region. So you can hear that it's got a kind of percussiveness to it, and this particular version is I learned from a two-kora performance, a recording made in 1996 by two wonderful kora players, Baleke Sissoko and Tumani Debate, who grew up as neighbors in a street in Bamako. Their fathers were very famous kora players who played in the national ensemble in Mali, which was an ensemble put together by the Malian government actually as a way of nation building after independence. And they would travel together all over Mali in this ensemble, and it brought together a wide range of different types of music. They are the griots. They are examples of griots, which is a very specific section of Malian musical life, and they would be playing with many other musicians. Ali Farka Touré, for example, was also part of the ensemble at one point. I don't know if with them, probably not, would have been later. So that piece they performed as a kora duet and a reinterpretation of it, and that's kind of what I'll be talking to you and playing to you about, is this constant conversation and where this music exists and how it exists and why and how I play it. So I'm going to play you a piece now. It's a very important piece to me. It's called Tubaka, and it's a love song, and I first heard it on a solo record of Tumani's called Kaira, which he recorded in 1987 on a trip to London. It was produced by a friend of mine called Lucy Duran, and this was my introduction in around about 2001, just finishing a long stint at UCT in the music college studying classical music, and then I heard this record and this piece. Let me play it for you and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. So that's what I heard on this record, and having been in the UCT music department for about 7 or so years by then, I'd somehow never come across the kora, really. Maybe I wasn't paying attention in the right way. I'd been listening to West African music for sure, but I'd never heard this, and I didn't have any context for it. When I heard it, I thought it was 2 or 3 people playing for one. It sounded like some string trio or something playing plucked instruments. And I really fell in love with the music because it had the counterpoint and the complexity of Bach and the music that I was playing on the guitar, but it also had this cyclical constant return, which I was hearing and influenced by in the music of the Western Cape, which was another place that I'd been delving into. But the way that the music was spoken about was a little misleading, because a lot of what Tumani spoke about it, he used the language of jazz, especially when he spoke about it. So he would say things like, you have the bass line, so he would say that you've got the bass line like here, in the right. So on the kora, that would be just on one, using 3 strings and playing just your left hand thumb. And the guitar changes a little bit different. And then he says you put the accompaniment in. And then you improvise on that. So this wasn't massively helpful for me. You think, okay, this music is amazing. What do you do with that? Do you go and learn the kora? How do you engage and learn from this music? So I learned from it first by listening a lot, and I heard a kind of way of phrasing and a way of playing any music that was already embedded in it. So if I took something like a piece of Bach, which I would have understood to be something that be quite sort of in a singing style, because Bach, the way we hear it now, comes through the whole tradition of romantic classical music. So you have this kind of line, and because it's on a page, there's a kind of metricality as well. But the kora had this gestural fire and this way of phrasing, which of course came out of the oral tradition, where you're learning phrase by phrase, and that makes you hear and understand the music very differently. So that was my first step, as I started applying what I was hearing to the music that I could play, because I couldn't even conceive of how you could play what I was hearing Tumani play. So that same Bach would become something like, so that was the first thing I learned. But thinking about it and listening more and more, probably a decade passed, and I started listening to it one day, and I thought, well, what about if I stopped thinking about Tumani in the way that he spoke about himself as somebody who was a griot, somebody who played these traditional accompaniments which were passed down in his family, but then improvised over the top. And what happens if I just saw the recording that he made as a composition, however he arrived at it? And therefore, if I started to reconceptualize Thumani in my own mind as a composer, because I knew what to do with the music of composers, the whole idea of interpretation, taking a fixed text and interpreting it. And it's a very rich and interesting way of engaging with the music of other people. And there's a sense of kind of communality in that, as opposed to just picking up an instrument and writing your own music, to engage with texts and the ideas of other musicians, especially through the ages, is something that I find very interesting. So the only problem, of course, is that there is no text except the recording. So I started working with the recording, and I slowed it down a lot, and I started to just retune the guitar. I decided, I'm going to use the guitar in any way, and I started writing these things. This is a tablature. So over here you have your lowest string is down here. That's that one, and then you have there. So that represents the 6 strings. It's not like the normal conventional staff notation, and I can retune the strings in any way I wanted to, and slowly, note by note, I would put together what I was hearing. And this in the beginning would take hours just to get that little phrase, but after a decade of listening to Thumani's playing and suddenly hearing it coming out of the guitar, so that's what's written there. Slowly put together lots and lots of these, and eventually I would have a language of accompaniments, phrases. The accompaniment like this is called kumbengo, which means the legs of the piece. So it's the part of the piece that just keeps it going. And then on top of that, you would have what Thumani talked about as the improvs. But I would just forget the improvising part in the beginning and capture what Thumani had played, and then see, what does the guitar bring to that? And then slowly through doing this, I started to understand the language, and it became a language that I could speak, but in my own way. The way that I did it, the way that I went about it, did have a few repercussions, because of course, not being with the musicians themselves and coming at the text, just like we've been doing with classical music for years, you don't really know the context and the things that aren't captured. For example, when I finally went to Bamako and to perform, Thumani invited me many years after I'd first recorded the music and had been performing it a lot. He said, "Come to Bamako, I'm doing a festival." And one of the first pieces I played was this piece, Concuba, which goes like this. It's got a bass line, same thing, which for Thumani would be in his left thumb. It's kind of a complex bass line. And if you were just listening to it, where's the one, what's, what, if you were tapping your foot to it, where would it come? And then the accompaniment. So I was playing this in Bamako with a big audience there, and they all start clapping in this crazy way that made no sense to me. And that was my first next level of learning, where I realized that there's like a rhythmic subtext and many others, and they clap like every third pulse, very disorientating. So the melody. So I'll end off, I see we're running out of time. I'll end off with a piece which is called Tita, and it would have been one of the pieces that Tumani grew up listening to. It was recorded when he was 2 or 3 years old in 1971 by his aunt, a woman called Fanta Sako, who was a remarkable and a wonderful singer, and who recorded for the first time a lot of what became the standard repertoire of the 20th century. And this is Tita, a very sad and beautiful love song. And this takes me right back to where I'm coming from on the guitar, because Fanta wasn't accompanied by kora players or even Ngoni or balafon. She was being accompanied by 2 guitar players. And actually I later learned that the piece I played you second, Tubaka, was actually originally written on the guitar or perhaps the accordion, and then was taken onto the kora later. So there's this whole mix of backwards and forwards influences happening. So here's Tita by Fanta Sako.
Oh, I have to clap. So thank you very much, Derek, for this, for the generosity of this performance, and also for just giving us the opportunity to be able to do a different kind of intellectual work. We really appreciate, and we're hoping that you just stay with us for a few minutes, before you leave us. So I just wanted to start again by welcoming everybody to this ethical humanitarianism series. This is another version, and we're really happy, to meet here every month to reflect about the ethics of our own humanity, and also our relationship, to ethics. So this series is a collaboration between HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa, the University of Cape Town, and also the Friedensau Institute for Evaluation, FIFE, which is in Friedensau in Germany. When I was in Cameroon, we used to refer to Germany as Bundesland. So it is in Germany. This is co-hosted and co-organized with my friend, brother, and colleague, Kwaku Ahinsam, who is right here. And I'm going to just give him a few minutes, a second, to welcome the guests before we continue. Kwaku.
Well, thank you very much, Divine, and good to see everyone this evening again. It's an opportunity for us to meet and to stimulate ourselves intellectually by considering the theme for today. I would like to thank all those who are here, especially Derek. Thank you so much for that wonderful piece. This brought back some few short memories from my recent trip to Mali. Thank you so much for the music. And yes, of course, this seminar is in collaboration with the Friedensau Institute for Evaluation. We are located in Bundesland, as Divine said, in Deutschland, Friedensau. And we are situated at the Friedensau Adventist University, which is a university that offers master's and bachelor education in social work, international social science, theology, counseling, music therapy, and other programs. Also, German language learning as well. If you want to improve your German, you can also take up a course here. But at the Institute, what we do, we are a research institute that combine academic and practice when it comes to development cooperation projects and humanitarian aid projects. We conduct evaluations, baseline research. We do also collaborative research, pure scientific research, as well as capacity building for humanitarian organizations, development organizations, as well as philanthropists and other NGOs and different groups as well. We also conduct feasibility studies. We also have special modules on evaluation and monitoring, project management for professionals as well. And we are closely connected to the Master International Social Science program here. There's an online version of that program as well. And we are very much interested in discussions around humanity, development, cooperation, humanitarian aid, and then the issue of ethics. And that's why there is no better collaborator than HUMA that we work with very closely, also through the personal relation with my brother, Divine as well. And so on behalf of FIFA and Friedensau, I welcome each and everyone here on this platform this evening. And I look forward to a very wonderful discussion. Thank you, Divine.
Thank you, Kwaku. So just to remind those who are joining us that this is the HUMA FIFA Ethical Humanitarianism series, and that today we are hosting two very important guests that we are going to be seeing shortly. There are three speakers in all. The first has spoken through music for the last 30 minutes, and we're going to see him just shortly before we move to those who know how to speak very well only through words. But the focus today is on power, aid, and dignity. And we have invited Olomide Abimbola, we'll see shortly, and also Merlin Inke, who we're going to see shortly. Just a reminder that this project addresses ethical quandaries that underpin humanitarian and philanthropy work in Africa. And we are trying to ask really important questions about how to build more ethical humanitarian interventions, particularly on the continent, but also how can the continent contribute, to thinking about all these conflicting ethics that frame and shape the world today. And in this series and in this project that we are building, we interrogate the irony and contradictions of humanitarianism that is worried about its own ethics, which we see as a deep contradiction and also as an irony, and that we are particularly pushed by this COVID moment, which asks us, to begin to really think quite deeply about how to do this, what we call this enterprise of kindness and enterprise of generosity across the continent and across the world, which is often geared not just to for the South, but particularly, for this continent. We want to know what new moral and ethical and legal challenges confront this business of saving lives, and what kinds of compromises, we should be making. So, at HUMA, at the University of Cape Town, and we like to pride ourselves as a top university on the continent and one of the top in the world. The arts and the humanities are really core part of thinking and doing the intellectual project that we are doing. And we are rolling out a project called the Cora Project, and also working with different partners across the world and across the continent. Currently, we are framing a project with the Omudili Foundation, which will engage questions around also arts. We are going to invite Derek to kick off this reflection with a very short piece before we say we invite Abdullah and Inche to begin to talk to us through what. So thank you, Derek. It's
okay, great. So a little bit of Jarabi. Tune the guitar first. So this is Jarabi, as I learned it from Tumani Diabate, the kora player from Bamako, Mali.
Great. Thank you very much, Derek. Just to say that Derek is a South African guitarist and a performer. Derek's music, as you have seen, is a particular and unique style that transposes, the a guitar, into the kora into guitar. He's mixing these two. Is at the intersections between looking for encounters between what he calls Western classical music and West African kora music, as you would have seen. We are privileged to have him. He has actually won the acclaim, has played with Malian griots, has also played and worked with Tumani Diabati, who really has influenced his work. And we cannot be luckier, to have him today. He generously offered, to be part of this intellectual conversation through music. And we are looking forward to having him, at Huma and at other activities as we go forward. So thank you very much, Derek.
Thank you very much, Divine.
In the future. So art is really important. Just to note again that at UCT, at Humanities, we are encouraging people to do all to support art right now because of COVID-19, which is really impacting art. All of these people who want to bring their generosity and kindness, to the world. Can you please share your generosity and kindness, to artists? At Huma, we have an artist, Ralph Borland, who is really helping us to do important work, with artists across the country and also across the continent. One of the spaces we are pushing for people to support is the Baxter Theatre, which has a very long history of art production. I did grow up in a theatre home and always looked forward to a place where I could actually find a theatre. Currently we have one of those theatres where many artists actually had their first performance being threatened, so we are encouraging people, to support the initiatives, at the Baxter Theatre. For today's session, we have really two important people. The first is my brother Abimbola, Olomide Abimbola, who is coming to us from the diasporic continent, both partly from, mainly from the place where we eat eba in Nigeria, and then also at the heartland, of Germany. Olu is a friend and brother I've known for so many years, also from his work and also what he's doing in the intellectual space and the development cooperation space. And he has just, together with many other colleagues, founded and established APRI, that he's going to talk about shortly, which is the African Policy Research Institute that is based in Germany. He is executive director. They're currently building it and they're going to launch it formally, soon. He's also worked with the GIZ or GTZ, but also someone who has worked in the intellectual or academic space and likes to debate a lot of theory and pretends to be an anthropologist. And then we have my brother Merlin, who abandoned us here, not just, how would I say, physically distanced, but actually always close emotionally and also intellectually. Merlin is a brother from South Africa. Merlin was based here at the University of Cape Town, where he was working at the research office and also in charge of many things, including resource mobilization. And we used to knock at each other's door quite frequently. Merlin is also a writer, a thinker, an author, and also reflects a lot, runs also a blog of his own. But currently, Merlin is associated and based at the WHO, the World Health Organization, where he is research mobilization consultant, and based at the WHO Partnership for Maternal, Newborn, and Child Health in Switzerland. So these two brothers are going to speak to us today, Olu and then Merlin, and then after that, we're going to engage them in a conversation with Kwaku and people participating and looking forward to your conversation. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Divine. Thanks, Kweku and Divine, for inviting me to talk about power and aid and dignity. So first of all, I'm going to say a few words about APRI. So APRI is a new think tank that we've just started in Germany, Berlin. The idea is to provide inputs to the German policymaking process on Africa by bringing the voices of Africans to the table. So the kinds of voices you normally don't hear in policy debate about Africa, we're bringing that to the table here. So we're about to launch probably this week, latest next week. So that's about APRI. But no, I'll get to talking about the topic that I'm talking to today. So in talking about the topic, I'm going to be focusing more on humanitarian aid, because I think it sort of brings together the other two topics as well. So number one, most often when you need humanitarian aid and assistance, it is because some people have been fighting over power, or because people with power have misused it. And sometimes those who are able to actually intervene when there are crises are people with power, so governments around the world with power. So, I mean, I think when you come to humanitarian aid, you're talking about power. And of course, dignity. I mean, one of the reasons that are given when there's humanitarian intervention is to, protect the dignity of human beings, to assist, to ease pain, etc. So I think humanitarian aid is a sort of good way to come into to the three of the topics. But first of all, I have to give a caveat. I have never researched directly or worked directly on humanitarian aid or assistance, but my research on trade in used clothing, especially between Nigeria and Benin, sort of unwittingly made me start thinking about humanitarian aid. So it made me sort of think about it periodically, and I'm going to talk about that now shortly. But before that, I'm going to tell you that you shouldn't expect any grand ideas or any big questions or answers from me. Like I said, I'm going to be talking about my experience in thinking about this, and then my unease with the topic. And then at the end, I'm going to drop a few questions, because my understanding is that part of the reason this series exists is to sort of think about what kind of issues we want to engage with around the topic. So I'm going to drop some topics on your laps, Kweku and Divine. So yeah, I first started thinking about humanitarian assistance when I was on fieldwork in Benin for my PhD in the late 2000s. So I wrote my dissertation on the informal trade in secondhand clothing between Nigeria and Benin. And one of the things that I tried to figure out was how the trade started, right? And I also sort of wanted to figure out why it was the Igbo traders who were most engaged in the trade. So not the trade between Benin and Nigeria, but the trade from the import trade into Benin. So, importing from the rest of the world, mostly the Western world. So I wanted to understand why that was the case. And by the time I started looking at that, I quickly got to the Nigerian Civil War. So I learned that if you wanted to understand why you had so many Igbo traders in Benin and having them essentially be the ones trading in a particular commodity, you would have to look at what happened shortly before the war. So actually a couple of decades before the war, what happened during the war, and what happened after the war. So the trade in used clothing in Nigeria started in the 50s. So it started through importation into Port Harcourt in Niger Delta area. And then from there, the traders would, through intermediaries, take it to other parts of the country. But by the 60s, they started exporting to other parts of West Africa and Central Africa. So they took to Cameroon, to Benin, to Togo, to Ghana, and up to Cote d'Ivoire. So many of them were actually away from the country when the war started in 67. So they couldn't go back to Nigeria. So I met many of them who were caught in Benin and Togo. And so they decided that if they couldn't go back to Nigeria, they had to, find something to do. And since they were traders in Benin and Togo, they approached the government for import licenses, and they got them. So they started trading in used clothing in in Cotonou and in Lomé in Togo. And so the war ended in 1970, and then they kind of could have had the option to go back to Nigeria. But then the problem was that, well, number one, Eastern Nigeria was devastated because of the war. But then number two, they had already started trading in Benin, Togo, like I said. And it had got to the point where a trade existed for them to say they could, in theory, stay. But what made it impossible for them, especially those trading in used clothing, to go back to Nigeria was that shortly after the war, the trade in second-hand clothing in Nigeria was banned. So every second-hand clothing you see in Nigeria today should not be in the country. So I tried to find out the history of the legislation, how come the trade was banned. I went to the Ministry of Trade in Nigeria to find out, and I couldn't get a real answer. But then the law, the legend in the market was that the Nigerian government wanted to punish the Igbos for starting the war. So they banned the importation of one of the commodities that they were most active in. I mean, I don't know whether it's true, but that's not important really, because it was something they believed in the markets, and it was something that they framed much of their interactions around. So that's one track that sort of got me to thinking about, the Civil War, and then got me deeper into looking at humanitarian aid and assistance. So the other track is where the clothing actually comes from. So I quickly started seeing that much of the clothing that you found in, in much of West Africa came from the UK and other parts of Europe. And that if you look at in whose name they collect used clothing in Germany, in the UK, in the West, it's mostly the names of the charity organizations that we all know. So Oxfam, Salvation Army, Red Cross, Save the Children, etc. So, but then the closer I looked at those two, then the closer I sort of started thinking about, so Oxfam and many of these organizations actually became what we know them to be now during the Nigerian Civil War, right? So as we probably all know, that was the first war that people experienced without actually being there, in the sense that they saw, they saw so much of the atrocities, right in their living rooms. So TV carried, the news of starving children. The famine was well covered. So it was when a whole lot of the humanitarian assistance as we know it today sort of started. And it was, Oxfam existed before then, but Oxfam came onto its own during that period. And the first humanitarian field action they had was in Biafra. So Doctors Without Borders that we know today was created because some of the French people working at ICRC, so at the Red Cross, did not like the position the Red Cross took on the war. So they left after the war to start Médecins Sans Frontières. So a whole lot of what we know now as humanitarianism and humanitarian aid was created in that space. And of course, as we're bad in Nigeria in teaching history. So I didn't know this until I started my PhD, and I kind of had to dig deeper into it. And so we can move a bit closer now to now, and then we can see what humanitarian aid kind of looks like. And I described that as sort of the logic of development cooperation and logic of funding, and also the logic of competition, right? So development cooperation funding means that if you have to show your impact, right? So if you're a humanitarian organization getting money from public funds in the West, you have to show that you're spending the money well, and that so you can get money to spend the next time, right? And in many cases, that has meant that humanitarian organizations have had to do things that are ethically compromised, like, for instance, paying fighters for access to people so they can, support them, so they can take care of them. So that's the logic of sort of, you have to spend the money and show your impact in order to get money the next time. But then there's also the logic of competition between humanitarian organizations, where once one organization starts paying for access, then the others have to pay, because if they don't pay, they don't get some of the action, and if they don't get some of the action, they can't justify why they exist. So they don't get money to continue existing. And so that, of course, I mean, just thinking about the fact that you're paying for access to soldiers, essentially, so that you can take care of people, that's problematic. But then, so when you think about it further, that means that you might be contributing to the war economy. And beyond that, you're actually relieving soldiers of what they've had to be doing for over decades. As soldiers have been having wars, is that you take care of your wounded, right? But with humanitarian support, you could just offload that to other people, right? But even beyond that, soldiers now know when there's war that you don't have to take care of people in places where you've overrun and you've devastated, because some others are going to come, and not just come, but they're also going to pay you for access to that. So, I mean, those are what kind of the things that I am uneasy about. But like I said, this is not a topic that I've worked on. It's a topic that, of course, I'm interested in and I sort of keep thinking about. So now I'm going to go to the questions that I want to drop on your laps. And the questions are this. So how does one design a humanitarian system that does not end up prolonging wars or leading to more deaths, right? Just like I described. So how does one design humanitarian aid and relief system that does not feed militants, sustain their dependence, and does not take over the responsibility of caring for their wounded and support war economies? And how does one design a humanitarian system that does not work on the logic of competition between humanitarian aid organizations? And how does one design a system that does not work within the logic of development funding? The last one, I'm going to throw this in and say that how does one design a system that does not give up the sovereignty of a country in crisis to foreign powers, even if the power is the UN? I'm hiding this especially because we know that blue helmets have been implicated in some serious issues in many of our countries. So yeah, I'm gonna leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olu. We are going to ask Merlin. Merlin, great. Merlin is here. It's good to see you, brother, and right on.
Thanks very much, Divine. Thanks also to Derek and Kwaku and Olumide for the introductions and for warming the space before I can start. It really is a pleasure and an honor to be able to participate in the Ethical Humanitarianism seminar, and more especially to be given the honor to share some of my thoughts and reflections with you this evening. So let me just begin by saying that much of my work as a proposal writer has actually centered around the job of creating compelling stories for funders to invest in with regards to development projects. And by this, I mean a whole plethora of projects like research centers to bursary programs, initiatives to combat the effects of climate change, soup kitchens, facilities for people with disabilities, land restitution projects, skills development and employment projects. And in all of this, I often wondered to myself, how is it that I can actually work myself out of a job? So in other words, to create situations where funding proposals and grants are no longer needed, where research and students are fully funded, where communities are resilient to climate change, the hungry are always fed, disability is mainstreamed, land is equitably distributed, youth have skills and opportunities to participate in the economy. And the more I thought about this, the more I actually realized that we will always have a need for proposal writers and development officers as long as inequality and injustice persist. And I became convinced that the work of development aid, of philanthropic grants, of donor funding is not just encapsulated within the moral obligation of the act of giving, but rather a matter of social justice, a matter of restoring and preserving human dignity. And the more that I looked at my work from this perspective, the more disturbed and the more uneasy I became. And not because I believe that my framing is misplaced, but because I came to see how the work of humanitarianism is often at odds with itself, how the power contained within aid sometimes acts to stifle the very same human dignity that it seeks to liberate. So in this presentation, I would like to share some of my disturbing thoughts and some of my uneasiness with you, in the hope that you may join me in being somewhat iconoclastic about currently upheld notions of humanitarianism. So I will begin by just briefly outlining my perspective or my frame of reference, which is formed by my personal background and my upbringing, by my work experience, and also from my reading in this field, and then apply this perspective on situations that give examples of how humanitarianism is at odds with itself, before going on to reflect on how a redistribution of power may help us to build this new world that we are trying to inhabit when the SARS-CoV-2 virus no longer threatens us, and when we can finally remove our face masks for good. So I grew up in the community of Chatsworth, which is in the south of Durban. It's a neighborhood that was constituted as one of the ghettos of apartheid's forced removal programs. And it was a tough place to live. It was cut off and it was isolated from the leafy suburbs that were heralded in the newspapers and the magazines as the legitimate pathways to success. And in as much as the trauma of this social isolation manifested in social ills such as poverty and unemployment and alcohol and drug abuse and violence and gangsterism, it was also a place where we celebrated birthdays, where we went to school, where we climbed trees and played games like guliganda and hopscotch on the road, a place where people got married and raised families. And most importantly, it was a place where you could always go to a neighbor and ask for something that you didn't have. And no matter how little your neighbor had for themselves, you would never walk away empty-handed. So the idea of giving was very much embedded in that survival mechanism of a ghetto community, that we are in this together despite the adversity, and all we have is each other. So our notion of dignity came from this sense of reliance that we had on each other. And it's only much later on in life that I stumbled on a quote from John Mbiti, which resonated very well with my experience of finding dignity, where he says, "I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am." So my experience of working in development offices, fundraising and resource mobilization units has brought me to a closer understanding of some of the origins of humanitarianism and what almost every state in the world has committed to as outlined in the Geneva Conventions. Writers like John Pringle and Matthew Hunt, for instance, point out, formal notions of humanitarianism originated in the context of war and arose very much from what has come to be known as the Duantist tradition, based very much on the work of organizations like the Red Cross, pertaining to the action of saving lives, of alleviating suffering, and restoring and promoting human dignity amidst adversity. So this understanding has also broadened now to include natural disasters, famine, disease outbreaks, population displacement, and systematic social injustices relating to poverty, inequality, and neglect. Such problems of human suffering or crises of humanity overwhelm local authorities and thereby demand assistance. But writers such as Thomas Pogge have helped to shift this conversation a bit further by equating humanitarianism with the struggle for human rights and social justice. And he makes the point that very well, we can largely concede that the affluent should do more to help the poor. But this is seen as a demand of charity rather than a demand for justice. He says, and I quote, "The existing radical inequality is deeply tainted by how it accumulated through one historical process that was deeply pervaded by enslavement, colonialism, even genocide. The rich are quick to point out that they cannot inherit their ancestors' sins, indeed, but how can they then be entitled to the fruits of these sins, to their huge inherited advantage in power and wealth over the rest of the world? If they are not so entitled, then they are, by actively excluding the global poor from their lands and possessions, contributing to their deprivations," unquote. So as someone who has grown up under circumstances of deprivation and isolation, I concur, I agree, that this framing of humanitarianism as a conduit of social justice and dignity reveals the discordance of efforts that set out to provide assistance while replicating the circumstances that created this need for help. Dambisa Moyo, in one of her many widely acclaimed works, Dead Aid, presents quite a riveting account of how the intentions behind development aid have been thwarted by geopolitical rivalries and self-serving interests and brought about socioeconomic regression rather than progress, particularly in Africa. This is evidenced in the stark reminder that between 1970 and 1998, when aid flows to Africa were at their peak, the poverty rate in Africa actually rose from 11% to a staggering 66%. So this was largely because aid was concentrating on creating client regimes of political and economic benefits to donor countries, thereby strengthening aid dependency and keeping beneficiary countries in a perpetual, what she called the childlike state. And Moyo gives that very famous example of the mosquito net scenario. And it's a very apt anecdotal expression of how this happens. She says, a mosquito net maker, for instance, in Africa, manufactures around 500 nets a week, employing 10 people who in turn support up to 15 relatives each. But no matter how hard they work, they cannot make enough nets to combat the malaria-carrying mosquito. And along comes an international movie star who rallies Western governments to collect and send 100,000 nets at a cost of $1 million. The nets arrive, the good deed is done. So now with the market flooded with foreign nets, our local mosquito net maker is out of business, with his 10 staff jobless and unable to support 150 dependents. So the aid dependency model has eroded whatever fragile chance for sustainable development had existed, whereas the goal of aid should be on creating good and strong public institutions that ensure long-term benefits. So going back to our perspective on humanitarianism as serving the interests of beneficiaries rather than political, religious, or other agendas, and avoiding manipulation by economic and geopolitical strategic interests, Moyo actually demonstrates how aid has largely served the interests of donors and neglected the opportunity to empower local structures towards self-sufficiency. Another more visual example of humanitarianism neglecting the cause that it intended to champion is one that perhaps many of us in the seminar has encountered as our first experience of humanitarian fundraising appeals. And many writers, like Dennis Kennedy, for example, have raised the issue of the ethics of representation, how funding agencies have tended to exploit images of human suffering. And much of the imaging of the global South is, in fact, framed around images of the anonymous hungry child or the homeless refugee. And these images are therefore contradictory in effect, since, fair enough, it does raise social consciousness, but it also discards that which is most human about the beneficiary. And that is their autonomy, their identity, their agency, their dignity. As Costas Douzinas explains, undifferentiated pain and suffering has become the universal currency of the South, and pity has become the global response of the North. So a number of studies have actually probed this notion of what they call the commodification of suffering through the use of images by funding agencies to elicit emotional responses that resulted in increased donations for a particular cause or the other. So, for instance, the People in Pictures report by Save the Children in 2017 and the Ready Aid research project, for instance, have fielded public opinion about the use of negative imagery in fundraising and found challenging recommendations for aid agencies to tell more authentic stories about the individuals featured in their communication, to give greater context, for instance, about the communities that these beneficiaries come from, about local development workers, about successful endeavors undertaken by beneficiaries, such that they are represented with a sense of identity and dignity and agency. And Dennis Kennedy argues that we can bring about this shift in consciousness from the public as external spectators to a civic and engaged humanitarian public. And in this way, agencies would be able to stop commodifying suffering and rather mobilize compassion for a deeper and for a more fundamental engagement. So the representation of identity and dignity and agency does remind us that there is actually a huge elephant in the room when we talk about aid. And that elephant goes by the name of power. Power is at play from the moment an NGO writes a letter of inquiry, sends a concept note, or develops a proposal for a funding agency. Fatima Asif and others point out that power imbalances lie at the heart of philanthropy, since funders hold the money or the power over beneficiaries. But there are also different ways of wielding power. And while much of this presentation has pointed out the blind spots of aid in its various forms, perhaps let me just spend at least a moment considering the ways in which aid works to fulfill its intention of raising agency and restoring dignity. Indeed, funding agencies, government development departments, philanthropic organizations, they wield an incredible amount of power. They have the power to take risks, to innovate, to advocate, and to exercise independence. The rebalancing of power within the context of inequality and social injustices, which gives rise to the need for aid, involves capacitating individuals and communities. So going back to Moyo's mosquito net illustration, therefore, the power that was directed externally could have been invested in building structures that capacitate local communities to exercise their agency and achieve self-sustainability. And this is where grants that provide capital, provide training and expertise with a comprehensive outlook on long-term goals rather than just short-term efficacious interventions, those are the grants that make for deeper engagement and for lasting impact. Fair enough, a funding agency cannot provide funding to a single organization to do everything, but they hold the power of influence and to garner added support for the organizations that they fund. It's heartening to see that more and more philanthropic organizations now are providing more than financial support. They are also using their power of influence to network with other funding agencies to provide supplementary support for organizations, not only through finances, but through resource mobilization, through staff secondments, through directly sourcing service providers, through making use of their own in-house services and expertise for projects undertaken by the beneficiaries of their grants. And many philanthropic organizations are also realizing their responsibility to advocate for these causes, to advocate on a national and regional level through mobilizing for policy and finance commitments from governments around these causes. And in that way, they are helping to build structural frameworks on which NGOs can attach their efforts and continue to hold governments accountable. So Equally important is the role that beneficiaries play among funding agencies and philanthropic foundations, in the sense that they are not merely confined to receiving grants according to prescribed expectations and agendas, but rather they participate actively in the discussions around these agendas. And they are intricately involved in setting those expectations, not only for themselves, but for the funding agencies as well. So it is encouraging to see how many boards of philanthropic foundations have made a place at their table for beneficiaries to provide the insights into pathways that need to be forged for greater impact. So in this way, foundations are building stronger relationships with NGOs and then enable them to determine for themselves how that funding is most needed and where it should be spent, rather than having them spend endless hours filling out prescribed funding templates and onerous reports that take precious time and expertise away from the actual work that change makers need to get on with. And this also involves foundations sharing resources and expertise with monitoring and evaluation in a way that is customized to the unique culture that NGOs practice and more closely aligned with their own voice rather than the voice of the funding agency. And in a similar light, we find that donors are relinquishing the power of representation also, and passing on the communication tools to beneficiaries to capture aspects of their lives which they value the most, and to write their stories in ways that they would actually like the world to understand them. It is indeed a liberating sense of enabling personal agency. And in this way, humanitarianism takes on a decolonial identity in as much as it advocates for the reclamation of agency and the restoration of dignity. So there is a reciprocal energy here, because NGOs cannot achieve their mission without funding, and funders cannot achieve their mission without the work of NGOs. And so in this rebalancing act of power, we do in fact realize that despite the adversity, we are in this together, and all we have is each other. So in conclusion then, in as much as humanitarianism has lost its way in many instances, there are far more ways in which it can triumph, and ways in which we can make good on our intentions to right the wrongs that have created the need for aid. The crisis that we have been thrown into through the global pandemic we are battling at the moment, I believe, is very much akin to the circumstances of a ghetto in terms of the isolation and the dislocation we experience. Even though this is a dark place right now, it is also an opportunity to refine our intentions. You know, one of the greatest writers of our time, Arundhati Roy, speaks about the pandemic as a portal for distillation and reclamation. She says, we can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred and avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies. We can choose to walk through it dragging all of this behind us, or we can walk through it lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So here we are in this seminar series reflecting on humanitarianism in a time of pandemic, distilling and refining our ideas. And so let us acknowledge the uneasiness, the disturbance, the discomfort, and the uncertainty, because it enables us to be self-critical and accountable, and ultimately to take responsibility for each other's sense of dignity. So I will stop there and hope that we can perhaps take these ideas forward with some questions and comments.
Great. Thank you very much, Merlin, for those deep reflections. I am going to hand over to Brother Kweku to engage you all and also to lead the conversations, and then we'll meet towards the end. Also, just to thank you, Derek, because Derek will be hopping off, but thank you, Derek, for setting the scene. I can also see some of our colleagues, previous speakers who are in the room. So just to acknowledge them, thank you for being here, and also those who will be speaking in the coming weeks. So I see Lucy Kirkling is here. I can see Triasa is here. Several colleagues who have been before. So we look forward to your conversation. Kweku, Olu, and Merlin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Divine, and a very big thank you to Olu and Merlin. In fact, I have been sitting quietly listening to the discussions so far, and it's pretty much deep thoughts and very provocative issues have come up. Of course, because we are dealing with issues of power and dignity and aid in today's discussion. These are not concept words or phrases that we need to deal with lightly, because they directly impacts people's life. People who don't have the power or the opportunity to even have these discussions with us. And therefore, we need to tread very carefully, but also be very open in our discussion about the topic today. Let me start with Olu's submission, where I like the questions that you put in the end. How do we design, I'll put in code, how do we design the perfect humanitarian system? I mean, it's a question for all of us. But you see, I think Olu was trying to play a fast one on us. Still, you will get questions from the audience. Your questions, we will deal with them as part of the questions by throwing it back to you. You have worked with these organizations. You have a lot of experience. So this is to let everyone understand that don't be scared by his questions to us, the challenge he threw to us. Still, we can ask him questions, so prepare your questions. But I think it's important to originate the ideas of humanitarianism, especially by looking at it from the lens of your studies some years past, bringing in how these powerful organizations even got their image through the suffering, through the war of other people. But then what has transpired over this period within these times hasn't really changed much. And that is very, very important as to how these power triangulations keep on occurring. And also Merlin adds a very, very important aspect of how the idea, what we have come to imagine as humanitarian aid, is actually at odds with its own self. And that is a very vivid image that he paints for us, looking at all the different aspects that comes together to make the case of how power, how aid is used to perpetuate actually situations and suffering in the other hand of people, on the other hand, of people who actually needed this aid. And actually it comes back to the question of where lies aid? In people's sovereignty, in people's dignity, in people's sustainability and growth as well. So, well, ladies and gentlemen, I think the floor is open as we start with the discussion. The chat is ready for everyone. If you have any question, please, you can either open your microphone directly and ask the panelist today, or just put it at the chat and I would read it out. So is there anyone? Let me see, there's a question here. This question is from Chikezie. Chikezie, do you want to ask your question in person? Hello, Chikezie, are you there with us? Okay, if not, I'm gonna read it. So Chikezie is saying, thank you, Olu and Melin. Olu, for the insight into how humanitarianism in Nigeria is tied to the Nigeria-Biafra war. As an Igbo person, I do relate to the fact that there is spiral of silence around the true and full picture of that era, and the fact that history classes in Nigeria do not teach the younger generation about that event. My question to the panelists is, how do less affluent countries ask for or receive aid from affluent governments and donors in a dignified manner? So I think this question is really, really important. How do we, so this is for both panelists, Melin and Olu. Melin, for example, how do you write proposals seeking for funding while still maintaining in a dignified manner, let's say, in a dignified manner? So in general, Olu as well, how do governments in less affluent countries actually seek for aid from affluent government and donors in a dignified manner? There's another question here. This is from Itai. Itai is saying that, thank you for the presentations. As a follow-up to Chikeze's question, do the beneficiaries of aid know that they actually have some power or can influence how they receive aid? We will start with these two questions. And Melin and Olu, you are both, if you're ready, any one of you can start with your submissions on these questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to just start because Chikeze's question starts with the Nigerian part. That is true, and that's a big problem because, like I said when I was talking earlier, I didn't know this history, right? And many people don't know this history today. Even though it's not just the history of Nigeria, like I sort of talked about, it's a history of the world in a sense, because it created many of the situations that we are dealing with right now, right? It created basically the things we're discussing today. Much of it was sort of honed during that period. So it's a deep shame for Nigeria that we don't engage with this at all. And yeah, we should have a conversation about how to fix that in itself, because that's a very big part of our history and that is still present with us today. Yeah. So that's one part of it. Now, the other part is how can governments ask of poor countries ask in a dignified manner? That one is hard, and I'm going to lean on my on my colleague here who has worked more deeply in this space to talk about it. But I'm not going to escape it fully. So I'm going to say this, that I think so. In many of the humanitarian situations, governments are no longer in a spot where they can ask for anything in a dignified way. Sometimes that's what you find, because there's a war going on. The world is willing to respond. The world is ready to come and respond. The conversation about how to engage becomes more of a different conversation than if it were sort of development cooperation, right? So it's a humanitarian assistance itself. It has a different kind of logic surrounding it that makes that conversation a bit different than if you have a conversation around, say, infrastructure development, etc. So, but another question also came up, that do countries actually know that they have certain rights around this space? Most often, what I found is people don't know that, or if they do, it doesn't come out exactly at that particular moment when they need to talk about it. So I would say that one of the ways, and I was going to say this earlier, that one of the ways that I think we can find ways of making this known is through these forums like this one, right? Like the kind of relationship that Fefe and Huma has discussing these issues. I mean, part of it is bring it out and discussing them, because people sometimes don't know about it. Even civil society organizations don't know about this because that's not what they focus on. So I think just bringing it out, getting people to talk more about it would already help in sort of shaping the debate in a way that would not let things tilt too much towards a certain side. So that's the humanitarian aspect of it. Development cooperation aspect of it. I mean, governments actually really do have a say in this, but it's also a bit of a different conversation, and that's part of what we need to find a way to address. Where when someone is bringing money to you, or someone is saying that we're bringing money, the way you interact with them is a bit different than if you're both transacting, right? So I mean, we say that, you know, the hand of the giver is always on top. So there's that feeling in there that I've seen both in bilateral, you know, situations, and also multilateral situations. You find this sort of in there. So I'm gonna leave it there.
Thank you very much, Olu. Melin, what's your take on this?
Yeah, no, just to add on what Olu have said, I think that, you know, when it comes to how do we ask for aid in a dignified manner, in a way that preserves our dignity, I think it starts by aligning on the issue. So, you know, when a donor country and a beneficiary country, or even just a donor organization and an NGO are trying to establish a relationship, there needs to be consensus on what the issue is, not on how much you need the money and what we can do for you, but on how we are willing to stand together. Excuse the background noise here. It's on how we are willing to stand together as partners on this issue and what we are willing to accomplish together. And so if there is this coming together at the initial start of developing the proposal, then the power is balanced. You know, the donor brings the finances, the NGO or the beneficiary country brings the expertise, and together they work towards this goal. So I think that, you know, that in that way we preserve the dignity, especially of the beneficiaries. Sadly, with the second question, many beneficiaries don't know that they have that power. And I think that it is up to the donor organizations to let them know the power that they have, and to create space at their table for them to participate in decisions that are going to affect their own destiny. So, I mean, it's sad when you see, you know, donors visiting organizations, and organizations are running over themselves, trying to get everything ready for these special visitors and lay out the red carpet, etc. You know, the red carpet should be laid out every day for the NGO itself. But I think that the onus is on the donor agency or the donor country to strengthen and fortify that message that we come in as partners, as equal partners on this project and on this cause, such that beneficiary organizations and NGOs can have their power and their participation enabled within the relationship.
Thank you very much, Melin and Olu, for doing justice to the questions that came. Let me ask you this. By the way, let me remind all of us on the platform that we are just 3 minutes past our time, but the questions are just coming in. So perhaps if you agree with us, we can add some 15 minutes to it so that we can get the last round of questions and then the last inputs, and then we can bring the discussion to an end. As I said, that there is a hand from Ralph. Ralph is coming in with his question, but before that, I want to ask this. So when we look at power, aid, and dignity, so we are talking about 3 different groups here. So let's look at the donor, the organization who is implementing, and then the beneficiaries. Okay, so even for governments, if governments are going to the IMF or other banks or groups like that for money or aid, whatever, there is the middle kind of man, and then the donor. Where can we identify the most the part where power is most centered? Because usually we talk about the donor, but I have also seen areas where organizations themselves, NGOs on the ground themselves, even project managers on the ground themselves, the kind of power they are able to exhibit and have on the community or on the ground itself. So I want us to also look at where in this chain is power mostly centered, and how do we break or reduce that power concentration within these chain of participants within this power, aid, and dignity aspect. Now, Ralph, we take your question. Please unmute yourself and go ahead with your question.
Thank you very much, Kwaku. And thank you to the panelists, Olumide and Merlin. I'm a researcher here at HUMA, and I wanted to just add something to the picture, responding particularly to Merlin mentioning the malaria nets, the anti-malaria nets. My PhD work was on the area of design for the developing world, and I was particularly interested in the storytelling capacities of objects that are designed for the developing world. So I looked at something called the play pump, which is a South African invention, which is a children's roundabout that children's play pumps water to a tank. And I basically followed the rise and fall of this project because it looked great. It told a wonderful story about children's play producing water in these remote communities, but it didn't actually do the work it was supposed to do. It was never tested properly, and it wasn't capable of doing the work it was meant to. But it presented a wonderful story to distant audiences that funded the project, especially through sales of bottled water. So they sold these bottled water commodities and they raised millions and millions of dollars for the project. And as a result, adult women in remote areas of Malawi and Mozambique ended up pushing these children's roundabouts around by hand because children weren't playing on them sufficiently for their water needs. And so women were turning these roundabouts by hand, and it worked less well than their original hand pumps. So you had this situation in which people in the South were performing to a script that was written in order to tell a good story to a Northern audience. And I came up with this sort of visual image of a screen that separates the South and the North, and onto the screen are projected images, stories, which people in the North see, and then support projects on that basis. And you don't see through behind the screen to how these things are actually used on the ground. And there's very little capacity for those stories of the people on the ground to reach those audiences in the North. So yeah, definitely, just your presentations resonated with me, and I wanted to add that mechanic to it as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Thank you so much for adding that important observation to the discussion. Teresa, please go ahead.
Thank you, Kwaku. And first of all, thank you to Olumide and Merlin for such stimulating presentations. Olumide, you have reminded me that one of our Irish aid agencies, Concern, which is now today Concern Worldwide, was founded as a direct consequence of the war in Nigeria. But I was also thinking while yourself and Merlin were speaking, there's a tendency to conflate humanitarianism and humanitarian aid, or a tendency to assume that humanitarian aid effectively means some type of humanitarianism in people, or some notion that people have a sense that they should treat other people, irrespective of where they are or what circumstances they are in, with some form of dignity and respect as people or as humans. And it seems to me that that is problematic. If you look at the history of humanitarian aid, it wasn't necessarily founded with notions of humanitarianism. There may have been some people involved at the outset of many of these organizations, and indeed Concern is one of them. People at the outset involved who genuinely had a sense that they needed to help in a particular way and were prepared to go against the political tide at the time to do so. But much of the notion of humanitarian aid has its roots in the ideology of the Cold War and in the divisions of the Cold War era, with the result that humanitarian aid, especially that which comes from the West, or which has come from often predominantly the West, was not only a way of being generous, so to speak, but it was a way of also fighting the ideological battle that emerged in the post-Second World War era between the Soviet model and between the Western model, and African countries, as it so happened, were coming on stream as independent states. just as this battle was heating up. So humanitarian aid became an ideologically driven tool to almost capture countries into a particular camp. Or at least that's one of the ways it's always seemed to me, that it's been hopelessly bogged down in ideology rather than in a real sense of humanitarianism. So that's just a comment. Olumide, I'm not sure it is possible, in answer to one of your questions, to have a humanitarian system that does not in some way impinge upon people's sovereignty. And I think we are beginning to see, the same type of ideas playing out today in the discussions around the vaccines for this dreaded coronavirus. Suddenly it has become who is going to donate the most in terms of vaccines. Will it be Western countries, the USA, the UK, the EU, none of whom are really doing anything much about it, or will it be China versus Russia? So we're beginning to see the same type of divide emerging again, as we saw with the original ideas around aid. Okay, people.
Thank you very much, Chiasa, for the contribution. Melin and Olu, please, your submissions on the discussion so far. And please don't forget my question.
I'll get to your question, but the last one was kind of directed
Yes.
mostly towards me. So I'm gonna answer that. So number one, how would you take away my dream from me? I want a system that does that. But more seriously, yes, I know. I know everything you said. I can even add another layer of ideology to it because there was a discussion during the Nigerian Civil War that it wasn't even the Cold War thing. It was more about Christianity versus non-Christians. Okay, so I know that, and that's why I was very careful to say when I started talking that I was going to be talking about humanitarian aid, right? Because I know actually the distinction is not just between humanitarianism and humanitarian aid; it's also between humanitarian aid and development aid, because they often fall under different categories, at least by the people who are giving out the money. So yes, I'm very well aware of that. And there's nothing much I can add to that. So the question, I think there was a question about where power is most concentrated in all of this. See, the thing is, before I worked in this sector at all, I would say it's the donors. After working in this sector, I would say that it depends on what you're talking about, and it depends on where you are sitting in the whole value chain. So in many contexts, countries that are beneficiary countries have actually been able to say exactly what they want. I'm not going to mention countries in this context, but there are countries that are very well known for being able to do that. And there are organizations, development organizations, MDBs, DFIs, where they are the ones who are the custodians of power, right? So they're the ones who control what comes in and what goes out, right? And in many contexts, there's also, the countries that give money are the ones who dictate what they want their money to do, because it's public funds from, they have to report back to their parliaments. So it's not that easy. It's not as easy to answer as one might imagine, because it depends on who and when and what and all of the other W's and H's. So so that's my response to that. I think there was another question about logic of funding, which I'm not sure I got. So I'm going to leave it to Melin.
Okay, Melin, please.
Sure, thanks, Kwaku. I'll begin with your question about where I feel power is centered, and it's a difficult one to answer, because at any given moment, and it depends who's asking the question actually at any given moment. I'll respond by saying that I believe the capacity for power lies within those who receive grants. Those are the ones who are closest to the issues at play. Those are the ones who have the expertise, the skills, and the experience of tackling the kind of issues according to the needs of the people who suffer the most. But not to forget that, as I pointed out in my presentation, that donors also come with not just money, but they come with that power of influence. They come with that power to be able to change governments' minds, to be able to put issues onto agendas and investment plans. And because of that, things start to change on the ground. So, it's more a question of how do we strike a balance and how do we bring about this balance. And I think that the more that NGOs are empowered and organizations are empowered, the more that this power will start to balance, and their capacity for power would be released. On the question that Ralph asked, or the comment that he shared, I'm so happy that you raised it, Ralph. It very, very closely relates to what I was saying about the representation of suffering that is often coming from the perspective of the donor, what they feel will sell the most and what they feel will garner the most emotional response from their pool of donors who contribute to that fund. And I couldn't agree with you more that narrative needs to change completely. We tried to do that at the University of Cape Town when we were raising funds for scholarships. We tried to move away from that narrative of your funding is going to change these students' lives. No, the funding doesn't change students' lives. Students change their own lives, and they change their lives in a way that they need to. Funding activates that kind of agency, and that is more the kind of messaging that we need to push when we talk about fundraising. And thirdly, the question that Teresa raised, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Yes, I agree. And Dambisa Moyo makes that point as well about humanitarian aid. Because in fact, Moyo talks about how the Marshall Plan was used by the United States after the Second World War in granting aid to Europe. And how that Marshall Plan was very much ensconced in ideology and pushing ideologies. And so when aid started to flow to Africa also during from the 1970s onwards, it was very much with that same sort of perspective, that we are not just funding you, we are also promoting and uplifting a certain ideology at the expense of the culture and the beliefs and the needs of the beneficiary countries. So thanks for raising that, and I think that these are very, very valuable comments that feed both what Olu and myself have been saying this evening.
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions that had come. Let's take one more question from Facebook, a Facebook viewer who says that, okay, this question goes like this: raising debts in the rising debts in the Mediterranean and the rising ethno-nationalism, civil strife, and the growth in secessionist demands, normalization of election rigging and contestation, undermining of judicial institutions, xenophobic politics, state brutalism, gender violence, natural health disasters, and social abandonment, economic strain, amongst others, are recurring themes in conversations about the continent, can be very well applied also to Europe, at least Italy for sure. I definitely think there is a lot of South in the North and more North to come in the South. I don't know if this is a question or it's a comment to it. So I think the idea put across here is that all the challenges facing the South seems to also exist in the North. And the one who sent the question, Laura, mentions particularly the situation in Italy. I think this evening our discussion has been very fruitful. And before I go to the panelists for their last inputs, let me say this. So I think the issue of power, we cannot, it's about who utilizes it. There can be chains of it, but we have to also acknowledge one more thing, especially the question that came about whether beneficiaries know about it. Some beneficiaries who get to know about their rights and how they have to be treated can actually be blacklisted from these organizations as well. I remember a study some few years back where you go to the field, civil society organization complaining about international organization blackmailing them or blacklisting them because they belong to a different camp of international organization. So even in situations where people or the beneficiaries themselves know their rights, know what is at stake, are able and ready to speak up, they can also face a backlash from these organizations on the ground as well. And the same thing also happens to national agendas for aid and others as well, where countries can be put on the queue, the last back on the queue, and others who dance to the tunes of the donors are rather pushed forward. We have to understand that one of the important aspects of this discussion is to not just come sit here and talk about these issues and just go home and sleep, but these are issues that affect all of us on this platform, wherever we are, whatever we do, even in our publications, even in our daily work. How do we dignify the people we say we are fighting for? How do we dignify the people we say we are working for? How do we make sure that the power we have, and I say this, that all of us on this platform have power in one way or the other. How do we use this power at our disposal? Merlin, how do you use this power in your proposal? Olu, how do you use this power in reacting to policies from the German government? These are questions that we throw out there for everyone to really engage with. Now I will take our last input from the speakers tonight, and then we bring the discussion to an end. So let me say this, I start with anyone who's ready. Please go for it.
Okay. No, I just want to say, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me to this. It's been a pleasure. It's an honor to be here. It's been a great discussion. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the future events around this. And I'm also looking forward to my questions getting answered, guys. Thank you.
Yes, that's a good one. Thank you, Olu. Merlin, please.
Thank you, Kwaku. I just want to echo all your sentiments. It's really been a pleasure to be here. And perhaps something that, we just as a point of reflection to take home, something that I actually presented to Divine when we first talked about this is, I think that we need to problematize even the nomenclature around beneficiary, donor, all of those kind of things, because we need to ask ourselves, who is benefiting from this?
Exactly.
If we're talking about a rebalancing of power and a resetting of the social order, don't we all benefit? Isn't there some sort of egalitarian, some kind of restoration rather of what has been lost? So should we be talking about aid in terms of the notion of restitution, restoring what has been lost? So these are just, obviously I didn't have time to do that in my presentation, but I throw it out there, something for us to take home with and perhaps to develop throughout the seminar series. And finally, just to say that it's been really a pleasure to be part of this tonight and to share with you these difficult, uneasy thoughts.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Merlin and Olu, once again. And just, you see the last part there, you just picked the word from my mouth, Merlin, and thank you so much for that. Because the follow-up to the question of where the power is centralized was, who is the beneficiary as we leave tonight? And I think that if you look at the budget that goes into projects, and you look at how much goes into administration costs and all the other blah, 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 blah cost, and what actually goes to the so-called beneficiary, we should really rethink and reconceptualize even the notion of beneficiary. Because if people get the satisfaction in their mind that they are doing good, and they are able to sleep well, they benefit from that token they give as well. So thank you for bringing that point out as well. Ladies and gentlemen, the issue of power, aid, and dignity, I know we cannot discuss it within an hour and some few minutes. I know it's a question or it's an issue that we will take back to our spaces and continue discussing. Thank you all for being here this evening, and we look forward to having you around for our next session. That will be session number 4, but I will leave that to Divine to continue. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you everybody, and thank you Merlin, Olu and Kweku, and Derek, for an enriching conversation today. I think we are left with more questions than answers, but also just to say that there are many ways for us to continue with this, and like we started, we said, support artists. One way to do that is to support artists in order to offer them a possibility, to continue with a different kind of intellectual work, and also in a more dignified manner. So we're meeting here again for the Ethical Humanitarianism series on the 20th of July. And we will be having Ornella from the Institute of Security Studies, and also Castro, we go from Cape Town. So we're looking forward to that conversation. But within Humor, we'll be continuing with a series of other conversations. Tomorrow, we will be having a really deep conversation with Pauline Otonji in the African Epistemologies series, and at 4 o'clock South African time. And on Thursday, we will continue with Carl Manlan about the Africa that we want. So have a lovely evening. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Yeah. And Divine, before we leave, please, just to remind everyone on the platform, these are topics that are sometimes very, very important for setting cortices. Please, when you get the invite, feel free to share to everyone you want to listen or to be part of the discussion. So do that as well for us. Thank you so much. Yeah.